Hey students, I am going, this is one of our lectures, of course, a short video lecture that's on the idea of imagery and also this concept that I throw at you a lot, which is the stuff of life. I've had students repeatedly ask me what I mean by that because I use it all the time, and it quite literally is objectively the stuff of life, the things that are around us, that we carry, that we have on our desks, is on the floor of our cars, on the walls of our rooms. This is it's actually the stuff of life is the collective concrete imagery. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get at talking about this stuff of life idea by first talking about the conception of the image, which is something in chapter 1 that of Practice of Creative Writing, Heather Sellers introduces to you. Most people think they know what an image is. Ironically, most students who I tell, or give advice to, and I'm saying you need to include more imagery. This piece needs the stuff of life. Think it's already there. Very few writers, deliberately avoid imagery in their work. What's happening is, since it's already in their head, they're simply not using it. They're not accessing it because for them it's already there, and so they don't attempt to convey it. Stephen King, remember, says that that good writing, that what writing is telepathy. It's getting what's in here into someone else's head. And imagery is probably the most obvious way of doing that. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a share screen on a little handout that I use occasionally on imagery. So what is an image? There's a whole school of poetry called Imagism that was sort of, I don't know if it was created by Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound is a complicated figure, but he certainly was one of the leading proponents of it. And he's the one who sort of famously said, "No ideas but in things," which is a statement about in favor of concrete versus abstract poetry. And by here, concrete, literally things, as opposed to abstractions, ideas. So, and he's thinking that you can get at an idea much more clearly and much more evocatively and accessibly through things than you can by approaching the idea and then trying to explain it, which is what poetry does. But his definition of the image is an interesting one. He calls it an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. I like that, except that it depends what we mean by instant. An image can be moving, it can progress through time. And sometimes my problem with this definition is this makes an image sound like a fossil. And even if it is a still image, a pictorial still picture, in a moment in time, we don't read it that way. We don't read it in the moment in time when it was experienced, in the moment in time when it was created. And as we read progressively, we reread the image within the context of different moments in time, which is why, as Ezra Pound also says, poetry is the news that stays news. Because it means something different every time we experience it, because we experience it in a new context. And yet it has a transcendent quality that it actually transcends that moment in time at the same time, which is kind of mind-blowing to think about, but that's what art does. But the other part of this that's interesting, beyond the actual sort of moment that's sort of isolated, is this idea of a complex, which suggests something more psychological going on. Pound was steeped in Freud, and one of Freud's, at first his sort of follower was this guy, Carl Gustav Jung. And Jung was very interested in the archetypes of the collective unconscious. We could get into that. I may in a later lecture, but for right now, what's important is this idea of the complex that we have. When we say we have a complex in idiomatic speech, we're saying sort of slang that I have a complex about that. What you're saying is that there's some psychic, basically, attachment, disattachment, uneasiness, pull, even threat or problem surrounding this one subject or theme. And what Pound seems to be suggesting is that these moments, these isolated, frozen moments, actually have deep psychic resonance. Now, and that's just something to be aware of. It doesn't, you don't make that happen. That is, and that has to do with the writers learning how to pay attention and how to recall. In my first lecture, I talked about it. One of the things that separates a writer from everybody else is this idea that writers actively pay attention to the world and project themselves into it and listen carefully and watch carefully and assiduously. And they're sort of curators of experience that way. And so we learn to pay attention. Now, of course, when you're writing about the past, when you're 7 years old, you're writing about something when you're 7, you may not have been paying much attention. You probably were. You probably actually were paying more attention when you were 7 to experience than you do now, because when you were 7, you weren't worried about half an hour from now. You were very much in the moment, most likely. So you were actually paying great attention. But over time, that's probably eroded, and you didn't know why you were paying attention or why it mattered. One of the things that you need to learn to trust as a writer is that if you notice it, it matters. And you can count on that and rely on that it is significant, if only for that fact. All right, let's take a look at a couple of really good, one really good example of an image that's actually from Ezra Pound. It's called, it's from this is the whole poem, In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. That's amazing. All right, so the apparition of these faces is pretty broad. It's indistinct. We don't get to see the individual faces. But then he works this metaphor, and the metaphor is delivered through these very, very precise image, or this precise image, petals on a wet black bough. He also gives us a full sense of the tonal quality. In images, it's one of the things that images do. They allow us access to feelings and psychological realities. So we see those dark faces that have now become petals on a wet black bough. Well, there's nothing happy about that. We know where we are emotionally. We might not be able to explain it. We don't have to, because it's been given to us as an image. And it has resonance, and we can see why that resonates over time. There are many different types of imagery. I'm going to go through a few of them here. And then I'm going to show how they work in a passage from E.B. White's Once More to the Lake. E.B. White, yes, is the children's author of Charlotte's Web. If you're familiar with that wonderful children's book, you're familiar with E.B. White. E.B. White actually wrote also a style manual, or was participated in writing a style manual that we use to this day called Strunk and White. So he's not a bad writer to learn from. Types of imagery. Okay, there's concrete imagery. Concrete image is a detail in a poem or an essay or a short story that has a basis in something real or tangible, not abstract or intellectual, based more in things than in thought. And so very much so, a hammer, that claw hammer that I mentioned, that is a concrete thing that carries a complex of emotional and psychological values. Sensory images, and many of them are concrete, are all images that draw on any of the 5 sentences. These include visual imagery, or imagery that you see, auditory imagery, or imagery that you hear, sound, tactile imagery, or imagery you feel physically, when you like you run your fingers across sandpaper, that is a tactile image. Gustatory imagery that you taste, flavor, olfactory, or imagery that you smell. These are all the senses, right? They're also, and these aren't separated. There's a lot of blur and blend. A sensory image can be a concrete image, can be a broad image, or a precise image. A broad image is big imagery. Sometimes our imagery can get too broad, but a broad imagery would be usually using something, a word that either connotes something very large or connotes a group of things. So the examples I have here are mountain or ocean or army. those are also pretty vague though. So it's not necessary that a broad image, a big image, be vague. For example, it can be made more evocative throughout without too much difficulty. So we can see that instead of ocean, you could say the steel gray Atlantic churning white caps in the storm. Now, steel gray, one of our negative habits is we'll just throw an adjective or an adverb to everything. So steel gray is an adjective there. But if you notice, most of the precision that comes in there is not an adjective. That's the naming of the ocean, the Atlantic, and giving me a sense of the ocean at a particular moment in time, frozen in a moment in time. In this case, actually moving, churning white caps in a storm. Broad should not mean vague or blurry. It just means large, vast, has a vastness to us. Then there's a precise image, and that's when you get in very close. So you might want to think of broad imagery as a wide shot or panoramic shot in a film, whereas a precise image is more of a close-up. All right, precise imagery gets in close, bringing the camera right up to the subject and letting it fill the screen. It takes a small thing and makes it quite large. So here's an example of strong use of the imagery in which E.B. White uses both broad and precise imagery, I should say. Let's fix that. It's the magic of modern technology, as well as sensory and concrete imagery. So here it is, and this is from his short nonfiction piece, well, not that short, but his nonfiction essay, Once More to the Lake. I remembered clearest of all the early mornings when the lake was cool and motionless, remembered how the bedroom smelled of the lumber it was made of and of the wet woods whose scent entered through the screen. The partitions in the camp were thin and did not extend clear to the top of the rooms, and as I was always the first up, I would dress softly so as not to wake the others and sneak out into the sweet outdoors and start out in the canoe, keeping close along the shore in the long shadows of the pines. I remembered being very careful never to rub my paddle against the gunwale for fear of disturbing the stillness of the cathedral. I had to keep myself from saying gunwale, which is a more of a New Englandy way of saying gunwale. Okay, so here, notice the interplay of concrete and sensory imagery here. Concrete imagery is quite literally the stuff of life, those things that we accumulate that both speak to who we are as individuals, as a culture, as a people, and who we are in a specific moment in time. Not just through the fact of our possessing these things or by being surrounded by them, but how we interact with them. So if you look at, it's not just that it's not just a canoe, it's the fact that this little boy is in a canoe. It's not just a paddle, and I love that, my paddle. It's a powerful personal pronoun, right? The way he's interacting it's not just, how that he has these things, it's how he's using them. He's very carefully using the paddle not to hit the side of the boat. He's as careful and for fear of disturbing. So he is revealed through his things and how he interacts with them. This is also a good example of a writing technique called sliding, which I might use in referring to your own work, in which a writer will move from a broader image or from broader imagery to more precise imagery to create a greater sense of intimacy between the reader and the subject. So you really get a sense of the camera being backed away and then coming closer and closer and closer and moving into its subject. And you can see this happening, although I would say this piece more comes in and comes back out, and there's a real byplay between precise and broad imagery. But you can see it moving from sweet outdoors to canoe to shadows of the pines, and then all of a sudden, my paddle in gunwale. And those are very precise. We're getting in super close now. And again, that was a powerful personal pronoun, which he takes possession of the paddle. One myth you should keep an eye on. Two, actually. The first myth is the idea that someone can actually involve a reader by not showing them too much. Now, certainly gaps are important in writing, but every time, if you as a student respond to my request for more imagery by saying, well, I was hoping to keep it vague there so that the reader could insert themselves and use their own imagination, you will get scorn and derision because it's not how it works. That's not how good writing actually functions. No, you don't include everything, and you do need to be careful not to overwrite, but certainly not during drafting. During drafting, is overwrite all you want and then decide what you want to leave out and what you want to remove. And until you get a sense of really, in terms of yourself as a writer, what you want to include and what you want to exclude. In the meantime, just include it all. It's hard to imagine what isn't there, especially from a teacher's point of view. But the truth is, if it really worked that way, that you can involve a reader by letting them use their own imagination and not showing them anything, the greatest poem ever written would be, and that would be the end of it. That would be the greatest poem ever written, because you totally allowed your reader to use his or her imagination. It doesn't work that way. So use imagery, broad imagery, precise imagery, concrete imagery. The second myth is that not everything in an essay, a short story, a poem needs to be massively significant. We, as teachers, now you can see how this happens, is we look at something, and because we are trained to analyze, and I'm going to do my next video lecture is on reading for pattern and how we should be reading. Sometimes we see patterns and things that really aren't there. We're conditioned that way. That's why conspiracy theories thrive. We are actually wired to see pattern. And sometimes that can be dangerous, but it also, for a beginning writer, can be dangerous in a kind of a reverse way, where we think that something's not significant, so therefore we don't put it in, and we end up with very empty, really empty rooms, empty scenes, empty stanzas, empty paragraphs. And the fact of the matter is, sometimes the value of something being there is just that it was there. Sometimes it simply adds to the overall fabric. And sometimes you really do need to trust, once you learn to pay attention, that what you're paying attention to, that little image that's stuck in your brain, that actually has value. You may not even know why it has value, but it probably does. And the fact is, if you don't put it in there, then you won't know later on why it might. An example of this from the paragraph I just read would be those thin partitions, which I do think have value. I can get into metaphorically as a literary professor and do my literary scholar professor thing and say, okay, the thin partitions are really about how thin the membrane is between us and the natural world and between each other. And it's metaphorical of that, and that fits the overall themes of the essay, which it does. But I suspect there were just thin partitions. And it explained, all it really did was explain why he was being so quiet. But, and it relates to that theme, the sense of not wanting to disturb and to stay in the awe, silence of this moment. But ultimately, the petitions were thin. And so he included them. And no, he didn't include everything, but he has learned over time, to trust his instincts. And you're going to have to develop those. So I have a strong advice is to get the stuff of life into your poems. Put those things in the poem that surround you and that help to define you, even if you don't really know that they do, or even if you're not that conscious of it. And it's from those that we will develop the evocative elements of your work and be able to discover these sort of interior colors and patterns and structures out of which that emerge from that imagery, and help to develop your personal tone and your voice. So these are just some of the things I'm hoping that you can think about as you're writing. If you look, the first journals have already been posted. The first reading response has already been posted. I did want to say, I had a few people asking me why this particular one wasn't posted, and it's not due for a while. Actually, I'm going to post it today, but it's not the video lectures. I don't like doing them all in advance. Part of that is probably laziness, but a lot of it is that I start to feel disengaged from the class if I do everything in advance and just kind of like, I don't want to just set this up, hit the start button and back away and wait for you to send me work. A lot of these videos are designed with particular issues that come up in class, or that come up as we write and as we explore and as we revise. And some of them will be specific to my experience with you as students. So some of these I have, you'll notice me referencing, and I'll try to contextualize that for you. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, well, hello, 379 students. And they're like, oh, I'm not in 379. But I did feel like that particular lecture fits what we're doing. And that's particularly true of some of the ones on poetry that come later um, on the schedule. But don't be alarmed if a link is not posted, and if we're not at the day when you're required to view it. I'll try to get them up pretty much in advance, but all I can really promise is that they will be definitely up by the time you need to view them. I hope you are well, that you are safe. It's been fun getting emails and starting to get to know some of you, and I look forward to more of that as we move forward. Thanks a lot. I hope you're doing well, and I hope this was helpful to you. And end meeting.